Hey everyone, welcome back. The video today is a visual tour of medieval and early modern medicine, or just pre-modern medicine in general. And the idea is to hopefully quickly, there's too many slides, I'll just warn you in advance, but they're cool. They're really cool. And the idea is to give you a kind of a visual tour of what's going on in medieval medicine, and more importantly, to highlight a couple of things that I think we need to keep track of as we move through the course in terms of how medicine is moving through Western culture generally. So, in terms of medieval and early modern medicine, there's not a lot of innovation, or maybe none, in terms of dietary advice. It's really consistent in terms of what Galen and Hippocrates said about the powers of foods and restoring balance and maintaining balance and using foods and the four elements and the four qualities to be balanced for your temperament. That general theory of medicine and diet and health remains constant throughout. In this course, we spend one day covering 1,000 years, right? This is medieval, early modern medicine. Next week, we start in the 1700s, Enlightenment physicians and what they're doing. So it looks like we're just kind of glossing over a huge period of time, and we are, but we can do that in this course because the dietary advice isn't shifting too much. But there's a ton happening in terms of medieval medicine. Medical culture is changing, medical learning is changing, popularization of medical texts, especially regimens about health, dietary manuals, the way people are propagating and translating and transmitting and preserving medical knowledge over the centuries. And so we need to appreciate that effort. And so it's important to highlight it. So I'm trying to tell that story through a lot of slides of text and manuscript that kind of illustrate what's happening. So let's get into the slides. Here's some manuscripts written a long time ago, 1500 years BC. And this class really focuses on the Western medical tradition. We started with Galen and Hippocrates and that so-called rational medicine. It's important to recognize, and that's what this slide is about, that there's this long history way before Hippocrates, right? Hippocrates lived around 400 BC, so this is 1500 BC. And the stuff here, I can't read these for myself, but people tell me that it's about surgery, it's about drugs, it's about basic medical practice, diagnosis, understanding disease, kind of the cornerstones of what we'd expect a physician to be able to do. One of the points I want to highlight in this series of slides is the work to preserve medical knowledge. You can see from the bottom caption label here, this manuscript is from Hippocrates, not himself, but his text known as Epidemics 2. He wrote a number of books on epidemics and how disease moves around and comes and goes in different areas. This was produced in Alexandria, as you see here. So hundreds of years after Hippocrates, but this is the condition of texts that we have sometimes. It's not all of them are this kind of fragmented, but piecing together what people actually wrote from the classical period can be very time consuming. So that kind of text that we just saw shows up in lots of different versions. Here's a manuscript version, beautiful handwriting, super easy to read. Notice that first line, vita brevis, ars longa, life is short, art is long, meaning the art of medicine. So we can't restrict ourselves as physicians to knowing just what happened in our lifetimes. We wouldn't really know anything. We'd always be starting over, right? So the art is long. We have to preserve this. We have to explain it. We have to systematize it and transmit it and preserve it. Here's a medieval manuscript here. Here's a even more elaborate one. You see the detail in the text. This is a large physical book. But the handwriting is tiny, it's beautiful. And you see all the other handwriting of people who were using this text, right? Another important point for this lecture, all these texts that we're looking at, all these regimens of health, dietary manuals, people use them, right? Most people in the Middle Ages were illiterate most of the time, okay? But there's a lot of people who are using these books to transmit and preserve medical knowledge. And these things are being heavily used, right? As teaching tools, as reference manuals, and so on. You can see an example of that here. Here's an early printed edition, 1497, I think. Look at the first line. The V is supposed to be an illuminated capital, meaning a hand-drawn thing. It's missing. Vita brevis ars longa, right? Like same text over and over and over again, right? Different versions of these texts. And eventually we get, these really elaborate early modern editions of Hippocrates and Galen in Latin and Greek together, so you can compare and contrast the different translations. The amount of work, again, is staggering. And then it comes to us. We look at these beautiful modern typeset book editions and we think, oh yeah, these texts are easy. Of course, Hippocrates wrote this, The Sacred Disease. It looks so easy and obvious. But in order to understand what Hippocrates wrote, you had all those different versions, all those different manuscripts, different printed editions, right? Variants of them. If you've ever played a telephone game, you know that the simplest message ends up something completely different, even after like 4 or 5 people, right? So imagine thousands of years and thousands of manuscripts, handwritten, all the mistakes that can creep in. We have to appreciate that work to preserve the textual tradition. The crux of dietary advice didn't change during the medieval and early modern periods. It's still based on the four elements, which you see here at the middle: earth, air, fire, water. The four humors in the body: yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, blood. Four qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry. Four seasons. Four temperaments: people who have a lot of blood as part of their normal temperament are more sanguine and sort of, energetic, and people who have more yellow bile or more choleric, more lethargic. Everything is kind of based on this. And it looks simplistic and it looks kind of dumb compared to, how we think about medical knowledge, but it's a really powerful system. And it's actually, because the basis is balance, the basis is individual temperaments, it's actually pretty effective at giving useful dietary advice, right? Different kind of advice than we value today. And we'll look the next couple of weeks about how that evolves. But it's a really powerful system. And we see it represented in all kinds of ways throughout medieval manuscripts. Here's the same kinds of things you just saw: fire, water, air, terra at the top here, earth, surrounded by the zodiac, which is important to note. There was a strong connection in medieval medicine between the zodiac, sort of astrological phenomenon, and medicine. It was thought that the universe was kind of connected, and you had to practice medicine at the right time. And you were much more likely to be effective if you were doing the right kind of drug at the right kind of time of the year. And different body parts were associated with different zodiacal signs. It seems very superstitious to us, but it actually makes a lot of sense. If you're someone like a physician that studies change, you are going to think about why things change all the time. But when you look up at night, the stars don't change, right? I mean, they change season to season, but they're fixed, right? The constellations are always there. The zodiacal signs are always kind of in the same order, right? It's the one thing that doesn't change. So if you think about their worldview and kind of the connectedness of everything around them, it would be foolish for them to think that there was no connection between what they saw in the night sky and what they saw on Earth, right? There has to be some kind of unity, and this is reflected in their medical practice as well. An important change we see in the early medieval period is represented here. It's Greek text. Forget about the medical words here. It doesn't matter. Look at the shape. It's a cross. And we start to see this association with healing and physicians with emergent Christianity, and the association between Christ as healer and physicians as healer. And this raises over time, definitely doesn't happen overnight, but over time it raises the cultural status and symbol of the healer as kind of this, shepherd of health and prosperity for people in general. And this is no better illustrated than here. So we see here Hippocrates. This is from the late 16th century, but Hippocrates, you see at the bottom label there, Hippocrates of Kos. And notice the posture. He's sitting down, holding a book, right? A book of a medical text for sure, right? Holding up his hand in this traditional gesture would remind everybody instantly at the time of another famous person doing the same thing, holding the book, same kind of hand gesture, looking off in the distance. This was on purpose. Hippocrates, physicians as sort of almost divine figures, able to marshal medical knowledge and expertise to restore health, right? In following the footsteps of Christ. Going back to medieval manuscripts for a second, we see medical practice at work. Lots of illustrations of what it was like to practice medicine. Here we see a physician visiting a patient, not doing too well. Looks like they're shaking hands. He's actually taking his pulse, understanding what's going on inside the body by feeling the heart rate and vibrancy there. Also looking in this giant, like enormous vessel. Normally they're not quite so big, but what's in there? It's yellow. One guess. Pee, right? Looking at what comes out of the body is a great indicator for physicians about what was going on inside the body, right? So we talk a lot about diet in this class, what you're putting in your body, but physicians were equally concerned about what came out, because that tells you something about what was going on inside. Uroscopy, which is the study of urine, was a very sort of nuanced branch of medicine. And you see a physician here in the middle looking at this vial, this green probably not good. Look at all the different nuances here. So obviously you're kind of limited. This text is old, right? The colors have changed over time, but the effort to distinguish between these very, very minutely different colors and indicate to the physician what's going on gives you a sense of the level of detail that they're operating with, right? We think of medieval everything is kind of brutish and crude. Not the case, actually. Not the case in medicine, not the case in basically anything. Here's another printed version. Again, this really dark one's a little alarming, but you see the different humors, right? Sanguine, choleric, melancholic, phlegmatic, right? Different temperaments have different colors. Medicine was very much individualized and geared towards different temperaments at the time, even for something as meant to be general as, looking at colors of pee. Another branch of medicine that I want to illustrate very briefly, give you a sense of the diversity and again, vibrancy of what's going on in terms of medieval physicians. This is an example of a medieval herbal, a book that's meant to describe a plant to you. And it gives you an illustration. I think these illustrations are beautiful. And you see that this is in Greek, obviously. Aconite, very poisonous plant, but can be used as a drug if used correctly, giving you a rough indication of what the plant looked like, description of the properties, how to use it. These herbals were produced all over the place, different times, different artistic styles, but they all try to do the same thing, which is give you this sort of signature shape or a signature characteristic of a particular plant. And you see all the different writing and sort of the power of the illustrations here. I love this particular image because you can see, I can make my cursor bigger. You can see this is an animal skin, right? Vellum. You see the animal follicles here. See it one other time later on. The work that goes into documenting medical knowledge, right? The illustrations here. Here's another example. Everything's blue. I think the ink changed color over time. When you look at these, you might think there's no way anyone could possibly identify plants from this. But I want to emphasize that's not actually the point. It's to remind physicians and drug makers what these plants could do, their signature sort of shape again, and how to use them in medicine. So it's more of a reminder. It's not like walking through the Sandias where you see a wildflower and you look it up in your book and you're like, oh, is this? Okay. They weren't using it that way. It's not how they were meant to be used. Certainly people who really knew about plants and medicinal plants and using them and producing them, they might have read these manuals at some point, but they're not carrying them around trying to identify things. Okay, so we got to think about how it was used, but it shows you, again, sort of the work going in to preserve, systematize this medical knowledge. Now, we see some things that look weird. Okay, so if you look up in the corner and you see this person with a plant growing out of their head, you think, what is that? And it might make you take the rest of it less seriously. Like, okay, these people are just crazy. So what's going on with this kind of figure? So this is an entry from Mandrake. So I'm just going to show you a couple other pictures. Here's a printed text, and you see it's a person, right? Long hair with a plant and some flowers growing out of their head. How can you take this seriously? I mean, it's clearly no plant looks like a person. Here's another one, the big leaves on top, tied to a dog. The pointy ears, I think, are fabulous. What's going on? Supposedly, a mandrake, if you pulled it out of the ground, would scream, and the scream would kill whoever pulled it up. That was kind of like its defense mechanism. So they would tie dogs to it, who apparently were immune to the scream. So the dogs could pull it up, and then everybody was fine. And this is elaborately illustrated in lots of different ways. Here you see this guy. He's tied up his dog, distracted the dog with some food, water, whatever. Tied it to the mandrake. He's getting out of there, and the dog's going to run off eventually and pull the mandrake out, which is going to be used to make some kind of medicine. You see the flowers on the top here, similar to that print illustration we saw, same kinds of things. Again, how can we reconcile this? Like, why should we take this seriously? And the reason is, if you look at actual mandrake, you can kind of see it looks like a person with a giant green thing growing out of their head. The mnemonic device. It's the way they're trying to get you to remember these things in the text that matters. So if you look at this is another page from the original manuscript I showed you. You see stylistically the same. The mandrake looks just like the actual image, and so it's easy to make stereotypes about the Middle Ages. They're kind of superstitious and crazy, and they don't really know anything, and they're super fantastical, and fantasy is everywhere. But there's often a basis to reality, that when we learn a little bit more about how these texts were used, why they were drawing things the way they did, and so on, we start to see the method behind the the apparent madness. Now, I want to emphasize again, I mentioned this when we looked at some of the other texts. These medical texts were highly used. You see 4 or 5 different hands here, hands meaning handwriting, different people writing using these texts. There's kind of an inventory of different substances here. There's all kinds of notes and things. To me, this is just the vibrancy of the intellectual work happening in medicine, right? It's not a bunch of quacks running around and selling people crazy drugs that don't work, right? People are really trying to understand how to use the natural world to increase our health and our happiness. And I think this text is really fun because you can see in kind of the crack here that there was a medieval manuscript. You've seen enough of these now, you can recognize them. There's a medieval manuscript that goes around the whole edge here, and they use medieval manuscripts as bindings and covers for early printed editions. This is printed, I'm guessing, 1490s, maybe early 1500s, and they would use old medieval manuscripts that were very thick to bind them and to kind of protect the pages, which were super thin paper. But you see how much use this got. This was not just sitting around on somebody's shelf. Here's another example, a pretty crude comparative woodcut, right, to mass producing this knowledge, stamping this image into all these texts. And there's the standard text at the top, but then there's also all this writing, again, multiple different hands, people using this text to take notes. Arabic tradition, Persian physicians, super important for the development of Western knowledge. Here's an herbal produced in Arabic, obviously similar kind of imagery, right? And it gives you a sense of how consistent and how traveled these texts were, right? People from all over the Mediterranean and beyond were seeing similar kinds of texts, assimilating similar information, systematizing knowledge, trying to gather as much as they could from different places, different cultures. Galen traveled a lot, as we saw, to learn from different places, see diseases in different contexts, learn about different plants. Now you're seeing this in the very vibrant medieval world and the trade that was happening. People got access to all kinds of stuff. Here's a Persian physician, apothecary, drug maker, taking berries, fruit from the trees, seeds maybe, grinding it up, distilling it, or somehow reducing it to its essence, putting it in the jar. He's going to put it in that urn, bring it back to sell, right? Beautiful, beautiful illustrations showing this common practice. Leprosy, you've probably heard associated with the Middle Ages. Here's an Arabic physician's cauterizing an unfortunate leprosy patient who has all these black things, which are burns, right? Cauterization is to close open wounds. Medieval folks didn't know about infection in the same way we do, but they knew open wounds tended to end badly. And so cauterization was important. But you notice how tiny the black dots are, right? There's an element of precision here. As barbaric as we might think this whole practice is, there's an element of care. And one of the great innovations of Arabic physicians was in surgery and anatomy and physiology, going way beyond what even Galen did. And he was by far the biggest producer of knowledge up to that point. But you see, these are surgical instruments. These aren't giant like machete things. These are really high precision instruments to do things like, well, okay, there's a big saw at the bottom that might be for other things, but especially on the right, these are very, very sharp, finely produced instruments to do things like dissect an eye, or perform eye surgery, or repair glaucoma, or take something out of the eye that's, it's not supposed to be in there. Understanding the optic nerve. They knew more about anatomy than anyone. All that knowledge from the Middle East kind of made its way into what we call the Latin West, so Western Europe, who was writing in Latin. All that knowledge kind of came together, right? Tremendous amount of work being done. We start with Hippocrates and Galen, we talk about Western Europe, but there's this whole other world of medical knowledge that's super important to understand. Here's a typical medical text, the sort of standard text in the middle, and then all around it is the sort of notes. One major physician from the Middle East we have to mention, Avicenna, that's his Latinized name. Ibn Sina was his Arabic name. And you see him hanging out here as the third person reading from this giant book, hanging out with his buddies, Galen in the middle and Hippocrates. He wrote this book called the Canon of Medicine. You see it here, Liber Canonis. But look, 1522, right? This is 1,300 years after Galen, and many more since Hippocrates, and they're still the pillars of medical knowledge. And next week, we kind of get into the 1700s. They're still there. A quintessential representation of the importance of these sort of medical figures. And you notice the ornateness of this frontispiece, of this printed text. I mean, the work that goes in just to making the title page gives you a sense of how much they valued this information. One key thing, you can read this if you want. I'm not going to read it to you, but one key innovation we have to mention changed medical culture forever, which was the development of universities around 1100, 1200, Paris, Montpellier, Padua, to name a few, developed universities, higher education, literally, and medical schools quickly followed. And so this is Frederick II created one of the first edicts that physicians, if you want to call yourself a physician, you have to have a license. You have to graduate from the university, which means studying for 5 years and working with a doctor, following a doctor around for at least a year. And you can see that in the bottom here. Uh, and what are you going to study when you're in medical school? Hippocrates and Galen, right? And you're gonna understand theory as well as practice. And now there's legal edicts, there's legal documentation of how to become a physician. What is the credentialing process? You go to these universities, go to medical school. We talked about Galen and Hippocrates, the ancient world, the classical medical tradition. There is no official physician, but now we're starting to see the formality of standardized medical knowledge, right? Which is obviously a cornerstone to how we think about medicine now, right? Everyone goes to medical school, you study for a long time, you work with other doctors for a while, gain that practical experience in addition to the theory that you learned from books and so on. And then now you can be, only then can you become like an official doctor. Fortunately, we know exactly what universities used to look like. And so this is a representation of a typical scene, right? People sitting in a classroom of some kind. It's typical sort of scholastic environment. There's a master, sort of the teacher, sitting at a lectern, reading from a book, probably Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, and students just like us, right? The attentive students are paying attention, taking notes in the front row, people in the back, dudes passed out, looking everywhere else. This guy's trying to copy off this person, the variety of people doing a variety of things, just like our modern classroom. It's hard to overstate the importance of standardizing this kind of knowledge and education, right? We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for these universities. In this case, we can see we have more in common with medieval universities than you might have thought. One of the most common, probably the most common kind of medical texts produced. We've talked about Galen and Hippocrates and all the different kinds of texts they wrote on epidemics and airs, waters, places, and diseases and anatomy and foods. The most common text from a medical perspective are regimens of health, dietary manuals about how to be healthy. And so regimen is like your daily routine. It's kind of like your regime. It's things that you do, right? So it's like how much sleep you get, how much exercise you get, when do you eat, how much, what kind of foods, how does it change from season to season? How do you treat basic diseases? Or if you're not feeling quite right, how do you get balance restored and that kind of thing? So there's just a million of these. We see them in manuscript form, just a couple of visual examples. Look at the detail of writing. I mean, this is amazing handwriting. Trust me, this is amazingly easy to read. It's highly abbreviated, which is typical, saves a lot of space, but it's the writing is fantastic. You can again see the physical nature of the animal skin here. Slightly less good handwriting, but look at all the space. The expectation is vellum is expensive, okay? People don't waste space. You saw this one filling up the whole thing, right? Abbreviating almost all the words. Why would you have all like half the pages blank? Because the expectation that people are going to use these. So again, I want to emphasize that point. Here's another one. Look at all the different handwriting. Look at all the different ink colors. There's stuff in between the lines. There's stuff in the margins and the bottom. It's everywhere, right? These things were highly active documents. And of course, those are manuscripts, right? But these regimens of health, one of the most common, most frequent things to print in the late 15th century, early 16th centuries, the printing press really got going. So the Bible is the first thing that's been printed. That classical texts like Seneca, Cicero, and then health manuals. Definitely in like the top five, I would say, of things that were printed because people wanted them. I mean, there's a lot of illiteracy in the general medieval world, but as printing became more accessible and more affordable, and the development of the middle class in the later Middle Ages, we start to see more and more of these texts. And you see here, regimen sanitatis, regimens of health. I want to explain just a little bit about this image. I think it's really telling about medical culture around 1500. So this guy is Arnold of Villanova, who's mentioned up here from northern Spain, very famous physician. His eyes look a little wonky. Look at his posture, though. He's behind this sort of lectern, right? Kind of like the university scene. He's got a book here. He's got another one here, right? These are certainly medical texts. There's no identifying marks. He has an armillary sphere here, which is kind of like a model of the solar system. He's showing you that he has this broad knowledge of the universe. He's not just a physician with medical experience. He's aware of how everything is kind of connected. He knows natural philosophy. He's a general like scientist, we might say, in addition to being a physician. So we see all the stars here, which clearly represents that link of medicine and astrology and astronomy that we saw before. Look at his hand gesture. Look like he's got that sort of Hippocratic, Christ-like pose almost of having this sort of almost divine information, right? And he's giving this, the jar of some kind of medicine to this person who's like abnormally small. That's to me, this is the perfect image of like what's going on in medicine in 1500. There's this combination of theory and practice and uniformity in education. There's still astrology and astronomy as part of it, right? But the idea that a physician would be aware of all kinds of things about the world. Another version of a regimen of health manual. I just want to call attention to these three sections that the title page is highlighting here. On simple medicines, we saw those herbals before, a huge part of how you tell people how to be healthy, right? Easy plants to get rid of headache, stomach ache, constipation, those kinds of things that people deal with every day, even in the modern world. On moderation of food and drink, how to stay healthy with everyday kind of regimen stuff. And then this last section on the strength of health from individual case studies, right? By means of private individuals. So like looking at how other people have been healed according to this regimen of health. So this idea of relating personal experience is something that we've seen a lot already, and we're going to see it over and over again, especially next week. Physicians saying, look, this worked for me, it worked for my family, you should do it. What are these regimens of health? Here's one image. We could show 1,000. They're all very similar. There's often a sort of irrelevant illustration. This one's on butter. What are the properties of butter from a hot, cold, wet, dry standpoint? What is it going to do to the body? How is it going to combine with other things to produce certain medicinal effects? How can you use this material, butter, as a food, obviously, but how can you use it as a means to restore and maintain health? You see here in English version, all these Latin and Greek texts that we're seeing in the Middle Ages and early modern period get translated into all kinds of languages. Here's a quintessential regimen of health manual. You see the original kind of Latin at the top. Underneath is kind of an English version in rhyming form, right? So it's easier to remember. And then there's a different kind of typeface explaining more about what the point is. And that's kind of page after page what you get in these regimens of health. Again, the popularity and the sheer number of these texts tells us a lot about how much people wanted advice about how to be healthy. And diet is a huge part. It's the main part of these texts, but they also had the simple remedies, the simple drugs, exercise, sleep, is how you're living in general. So diet was the most important part of that, but it wasn't the only part. Okay, the last slide is just a reminder that all these texts we've been looking at, all this handwriting, all these printed text, it looks kind of staid and boring, but I have to remind you, medieval people also had a good sense of humor. They didn't have Netflix or TikTok, so they entertained themselves with these kinds of doodles, an indicator they like to have a laugh just like we do. Okay, that's it for the slide. I just want to emphasize a couple of points. Think about the work that goes in to preserving medical knowledge over thousands of years. Like it's tremendous. You saw all those images of different kinds of text, manuscripts printed. You saw how well they were used, all that separate handwriting on those different pages. Uroscopy, cauterization, anatomy, dissections of eyes, medical tools, all of these different things, I hope, paint a picture of how vibrant medical practice was in the medieval and early modern periods, right? It's very, again, I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. It's a stereotypical image of Middle Ages is everyone's ignorant and running around killing each other. And yeah, okay, there was some conflict, but there was a lot of intellectual activity that was absolutely sort of almost mind-blowing, right? The amount of things that they got done over a long period of time. Medical schools, still important. That's their invention, standardizing medical knowledge, preserving and adding, systematizing over time. It's a tremendous accomplishment. We're doing it in this class because the dietary advice didn't change really in terms of theory or practice, but the way they talk about it, the kinds of texts they produce change. The amount of people who could get those texts changed. The way they talk about it in different languages changed. There's a lot going on. So let's keep that in mind as we move through the course. See you in the next one.